Close your eyes. Imagine a long house. Long and low, built of timber and turf, its roof heavy with sod against the winter cold. Inside, a long fire burns down the center of the floor, the smoke drifting upward through a hole in the roof. The smell of wood smoke and salted meat and wet wool drying by the fire. Outside, the wind is coming off the water, that particular Norse wind that carries in it the smell of salt and ice and distance. This is Scandinavia, around the 9th century of the Christian era. And in longhouses like this one, all across the cold countries of the north, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, men are gathering to hear the skalds sing. The skalds are the poets, the keepers of memory, the men who turn the deeds of the great into words that can be carried across generations, who transform the living into legend before the living have even finished living. Tonight you are the skald. Tonight you will tell 10 stories, 10 chapters in the long history of the Viking Age, the era that ran from roughly 793 AD, when Norse raiders first struck the monastery at Lindisfarne on the northeast coast of England, to 1066 when Harald Hardrada fell at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, and the age of the great Viking warrior kings ended forever. 2.5 centuries of extraordinary people, of kings who were also poets, sailors who were also explorers, warriors who were also statesmen, of the men who ruled the north. So settle in beside the fire, let the wind come, let the longhouse walls creak in the dark, and let the stories begin. Chapter 1, Ragnarlothbrok, the legend at the edge of history. He stands at the farthest reaches of our past, in the dim grey mists that bridge myth and history. Ragnar Lothbrok. His name in Old Norse means something like Ragnar Shaggy Breeches, a nickname that, according to the sagas, he acquired from the leather trousers he made for himself to fight a dragon. This tells you something about the kind of stories that were told about him. Whether Ragnar Lothbrok was a single historical person, a legend built around multiple real raiders, or some combination of both, historians still debate. He most likely was a warlord and king of Denmark and Sweden and the first Scandinavian to invade Britain. He is mentioned in several sagas, most significantly the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok and the jester Danelaw. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle also refers to Ragnar and Reginharus as a powerful and prominent Viking raider from 840 AD. These names could be two variations of Ragnar. What the sagas tell us is extraordinary. Ragnar was a raider of legendary audacity. He led raids on England and on France, including, according to the most famous account, the Siege of Paris in 845 AD, when a Viking fleet sailed up the Seine and besieged the greatest city in the Frankish kingdom. Ragnar is credited with leading the Siege of Paris and inspiring the great heathen army, although his historical existence remains debated. The story of the Siege of Paris is almost too dramatic to believe. The Viking fleet, reportedly 120 longships carrying 5,000 warriors, sailed up the Seine in March 845 AD. The Frankish king Charles the Bald attempted to stop them by dividing his forces on both banks of the river. Ragnar captured one force, hanged 111 prisoners on an island in the river in full view of the other force, and the other force fled. Paris was taken, or rather, Paris was threatened until Charles paid an enormous ransom, 7,000 pounds of silver and gold, to make Ragnar go away. Ragnar took the money and went home. His sons were, if anything, more famous than he was. Legends tell us that Ragnar had 3 wives, the third of whom was a Slorg, who bore him sons Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside and Sigurd Snake in the Eye, all 3 of whom would grow greater in stature and fame than he. The end of Ragnar's story, is one of the most famous in Norse mythology. Seeking to prove himself greater than his sons, he sailed to England with only 2 ships, a deliberately reckless act of bravado. He was overwhelmed by the forces of King Aelle and was thrown into a pit of snakes where he foretold the arrival of the great heathen army of 865 AD with his famous quote, "How the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers." His sons heard what had been done to their father. They gathered their ships and their warriors, and in 865 AD, the great heathen army landed on the coast of England, the largest Norse invasion force England had ever seen. It would take 13 years to be driven out, and while it occupied England, it fundamentally changed the country forever. All of it, according to the legend, to avenge one man thrown into a pit of snakes. Whether Ragnar was real or legend, his story shaped the Viking Age. Many kings and leaders from Guthrum to Cnut the Great claim a lineage to this most elusive of heroes. The legend was more powerful than any single historical man could have been. Chapter 2, Ivar the Boneless, the commander without legs. Of all Ragnar's sons, the most feared was perhaps the strangest. Ivar the Boneless. Ivar supposedly owes his nickname to a condition that caused his legs to fracture easily, making his fearsome reputation all the more impressive. Indeed, Ivar the Boneless was known to be a berserker, a champion Norse warriors who fought in a trance-like fury. The exact meaning of the nickname has been debated by historians for generations. Some believe it referred to a genuine physical condition, brittle bone disease, or some form of paralysis. Some believe it was a kenning, a poetic description, boneless meaning flexible, cunning, snake-like in his movements. Some believe it referred to exceptional physical agility rather than disability. What all the sources agree on is that Ivar was extraordinary, a commander of remarkable strategic and tactical intelligence, a man who could plan a campaign across multiple years and multiple fronts with a precision unusual for his era. When the great heathen army landed in East Anglia in 865 AD, Ivar was among its leaders alongside his brothers Halfdan and Ubb. This invasion was to take revenge for his father from Aelle, king of Northumbria, who had executed Ragnar in 865. The invasion resulted in reconciliation after some fighting. However, Aelle was captured and executed in 867 by Ivar's army. The execution of King Aelle is one of the most gruesome stories in the Norse sagas, the blood eagle, in which the ribs are separated from the spine and the lungs pulled through the opening to flutter like wings. Whether this actually happened or whether it is a later embellishment of the story, historians debate. But the capture and killing of Aelle, the man who had thrown Ragnar into the snake pit, was real. Ivar then turned his attention to York, Jorvik in the Norse tongue, the great city of northern England. Ivar is thought to have established the Viking hold over York and helped the Norse secure control of a large portion of England, leading to the eventual establishment of the Danelaw. The Danelaw, the region of northern and eastern England that came under Norse law and governance, was the most significant territorial conquest of the Viking Age in Britain. It shaped the English language, English place names, English law, and English culture in ways that are still visible today. Thousands of English place names ending in by, Thorpe, Thwaite are Norse in origin. The very word law in the English language comes from the Old Norse word lag. The Viking presence in England left marks that 14 centuries have not erased. Ivar's later career took him to Ireland, where he is believed to have established the Uí Norse-Gael dynasty in Ireland. He died around 873 AD of natural causes, according to most sources, which made him unusual among his brothers. The boneless one, the commander with legs that might not work properly, who nevertheless marched his army across the breadth of England and changed it forever. Chapter 3 Bjorn Ironside, the raider of the Mediterranean. While Ivar was changing England, his brother was changing the world. Bjorn Ironside. Bjorn was the son of Ragnar Lothbrok and was renowned for the raids he led on France, England, and along the Mediterranean coastline. The raid that made Bjorn's reputation was not in the cold waters of the North Sea, but in the warm blue waters of the Mediterranean, waters that Norse ships had never previously sailed. In 859 AD, Bjorn and his ally Haystein departed from the Norse base on the Seine with a fleet of perhaps 62 longships. They sailed south along the coast of France and Spain. They passed through the Strait of Gibraltar, the Pillars of Hercules, the edge of the known world in ancient geography, and entered the Mediterranean. What followed was 3 years of raiding across the entire western Mediterranean. They raided the coast of Morocco, they raided the Balearic Islands, they raided the coast of southern France, they overwinter in the Camargue marshes of the Rhone Delta, they sailed to Italy and raided the coasts of Liguria and Tuscany. The furthest that the brothers got to was Luni, an Italian town on the border of Liguria and Tuscany. The story of the capture of Luni is one of the great pieces of Viking legend. The city had strong walls and refused to open its gates. Haystein is thought to have originated the Viking ploy of pretending to convert to Christianity, feigning death, and being carried through the gates of a city only to miraculously revive, kill his would-be benefactors, and open the gates for his men. The story goes that Haystein sent word to the Bishop of Luni that he was dying and wished to receive Christian baptism and a Christian burial before his death. The bishop agreed. Haystein was carried into the city in a coffin, attended by a small group of mourners. When the coffin was opened in the church, Haystein leapt out, very much alive, sword in hand. He killed the bishop and the clergy. His men fought their way to the gates. The gates were opened. Luni fell. Whether this story is entirely true, or embellished, or legendary, it became the template for Viking cunning in the same way that Thermopylae became the template for heroic last stands. Bjorn and Haystein eventually returned to the Norse lands, their ships heavy with plunder. They had been gone 3 years and had sailed further south and east than any Norse fleet before them. The world was larger than even the Vikings had imagined, and Bjorn Ironside had shown them how large. Chapter 4 Rollo of Normandy, the Viking who became French. In 911 AD, something remarkable happened on the banks of the Seine. A Viking chieftain and a French king made a deal. The Viking was Rollo, a Norse chieftain of obscure origin. He was, by the accounts that survive, enormous in physical size, so large that no horse could carry him, and he had to walk wherever he went, earning the nickname Rollo the Walker. He gave Rouen in exchange for his alliance with France, and it was agreed that he would extend his authority over Viking settlers. The deal that King Charles the Simple made with Rollo at the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte in 911 AD was elegant in its pragmatism. Rollo and his followers had been raiding the Seine Valley for years, threatening Paris repeatedly, causing enormous damage and instability. Charles could not destroy them militarily. He had tried and failed. So he offered them what they had been taking by force. The region at the mouth of the Seine, the rich agricultural land of northern France that would become Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Rollo could have it. He would become the Count of Rouen, a vassal of the French crown. In return, he would protect the Sweyn Valley from other Viking raiders, convert to Christianity, and stop attacking France himself. Rollo agreed. The ceremony of submission required Rollo to kneel and kiss the foot of King Charles. According to the Chronicle, Rollo refused to kneel, but sent one of his men to perform the gesture on his behalf. The man grabbed the king's foot and lifted it to his lips without bending down, toppling the king from his throne. The Normans were not going to be easy vassals. Rollo was baptized into the Christian faith later in life, and he encouraged his people to do the same. Within 2 generations, his descendants were more French than Norse. They spoke French, they built French-style castles, they adopted French feudal structures. But they never entirely lost the Viking hunger for new territory. Rollo's great-great-great-grandson was William the Conqueror, who in 1066 sailed across the English Channel and conquered England. The descendants of the Viking who had settled for a deal on the Sweyn ended up ruling England. 1066, with the death of Harald Godwinson and Harald Hardrada, is said to mark the end of both Anglo-Saxon Britain and the Viking Age of Scandinavia. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking warrior king, died at Stamford Bridge. William the Conqueror, the descendant of Rollo, won at Hastings. The Viking Age ended with a Viking's grandson on the English throne. Rollo had planned better than anyone knew. Chapter 5, Harald, the first king of Norway. The story of how Norway became a single kingdom begins with a woman who said no. The unification of Norway started with the rejection of his marriage proposal by Gyda, who was the daughter of Erik, king of Hordaland. She refused to marry Harald before he was king over all of Norway. Harald was furious, and then he made a vow. He swore that he would not cut his hair or comb it until he was king of all Norway. He spent the next 10 years making good on that vow. According to the stories from sources such as Harald's Saga and others, Harald Fairhair was the first king of a united Norway. His epithet is closely associated with his rise to power. Norway in the 9th century was not a kingdom. It was a collection of petty kingdoms, small regional territories each ruled by its own local king or jarl. These rulers were fiercely independent. They had no tradition of subordinating themselves to a higher authority. Harald changed that. Through a combination of military victory, strategic marriage, and the careful co-opting of former enemies, he brought the kingdoms of Norway under a single authority one by one. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Hafrsfjord, fought sometime between 872 and 900 AD, in the waters of a fjord near what is now the city of Stavanger. Harald's fleet met a coalition of regional kings who had combined against him in a battle that would decide the future of Norway. Harald won. In 882, Harald became the sole ruler of Norway. He finally cut his hair. The matted, uncut mane of a decade of campaigning was trimmed by the Earl of Mur, and Harald received his permanent epithet, Fairhair, the beautiful, flowing golden hair that he had been growing since the day a princess told him he was not worthy of her. He had kept his promise to himself. Harald Fairhair is remembered as the first king of all Norway. He is one of the rare Viking warriors on this list who did not die a violent death and actually died from old age at the age of 80. He fathered over 20 sons, including notable Viking kings such as Erik Bloodaxe and Håkon the Good. 20 sons, including the one who would be remembered as one of the most violent rulers in Norse history, and another who would be remembered as one of the most beloved. the father of Norway and the father of its contradictions. Chapter 6 Erikbloodx, the king who killed his brothers. Erik Haraldsson was Harald Fairhair's favourite son, and he became one of the most feared kings in Norse history. Born into the Viking lifestyle, Erik Bloodaxe was one of the many sons of Norway's first king, Harald Fairhair. He is said to have participated in bloody raids across Europe from the age of 12, and quickly learned that violence was the most effective way to distinguish yourself in the Viking community. Erik gained his evocative nickname by murdering all but one of his brothers. Harald Fairhair had many sons, too many sons, sons who competed with each other for power, who plotted against each other, who fought each other with the particular ferocity that family rivalry generates. Erik's solution was simple. He killed them. Not all of them, but enough. Brother by brother, rival by rival, he reduced the competition until only one brother remained. Harkon, the youngest, who had been sent to be fostered at the court of King Athelstan of England, and who was safe from Erik's reach. Erik became king of Norway around 930 AD, inheriting his father's throne. His queen was Gunhild. The sagas mention that Erik was married to Gunhild, who is said to have been an evil witch with a strong influence over her husband. Whether Gunhild was actually a witch or simply a politically formidable woman whose enemies found it convenient to label her supernatural, the sources are consistent about one thing: she was dangerous, intelligent, and at the center of everything that happened during Erik's reign. Erik's rule in Norway was short and brutal. His violence had made him enemies even among those who supported him. When his brother Harkon returned from England with an army and the backing of the Norwegian nobles who had tired of Erik's methods, Erik found himself without sufficient support to hold on. He was expelled from Norway. He went to England. Erik became king of Northumbria, England, for a period, evidenced by coins bearing his name. Jorvik was the capital of the Viking kingdom of Northumbria. Under Erik's rule, it became for a time one of the most sophisticated urban centers in northern Europe. Coins were minted with his name on them. Craftspeople and merchants from across the Norse world gathered there. The city flourished. But Erik's reign was unstable. He was expelled, returned, expelled again. He had made too many enemies. Ragnar Lothbrok, Erik Bloodaxe, and Harald Hardrada are a trio of legendary Viking warriors. Towards the end of their careers, each man sailed his longships upriver to Jorvik or York. Not one of them survived to make the journey home. Erik Bloodaxe was killed in battle at Stainmore in 954 AD, ambushed, according to the sources, by a force led by a man named Maccus, possibly acting on behalf of the King of England. He died as he had lived, violently, in the north of England, far from the Norway he had been born to rule. His wife Gunhild fled with their children. The legend of the Bloodaxe king persisted long after the man himself was gone. Chapter 7 Harald Bluetooth, the king who gave his name to your phone. There is a king from the Viking Age, whose name you have probably used today without knowing it. Harald Bluetooth. King of both Denmark and Norway, Harald Bluetooth was a fearsome ruler who established a series of circular fortresses, whose remains today stand as a symbol of his power. Bluetooth is also thought to be responsible for introducing Christianity to Denmark. His son, Sweyn Forkbeard, and grandson, Cnut the Great, would also rule England. And if that is not enough, his legacy also extends to lending his name to Bluetooth. one of the most ubiquitous pieces of technology in the 21st century. The wireless technology that connects your phone to your headphones was named after a 10th century Viking king. The Bluetooth logo is a runic monogram combining the initials H and B, Harald Bluetooth, in the Elder Futhark alphabet. The engineers who developed the technology in the 1990s chose the name because Harald Bluetooth had famously united the Danish tribes, and they wanted their wireless protocol to unite communication standards. Harald Bluetooth, uniting devices just as he once united Danes. The king himself was formidable in ways that go beyond his technological legacy. He ruled Denmark from approximately 958 to 986 AD. He incorporated Norway into his realm, establishing the first unified Nordic kingdom. He built the extraordinary Trelleborg ring fortresses, massive circular earthwork fortifications, built with remarkable precision to a standardized plan that served as military bases, administrative centers, and demonstrations of royal power. 5 of these fortresses have been identified in Denmark. They were built to an almost identical circular plan, with 4 gates oriented to the cardinal directions, internal roads crossing at the center, and barracks arranged in precise geometric patterns within the ring. They are among the most impressive military engineering works of the Viking Age. Harald also erected the Jelling stones, 2 massive rune stones that stand at Jelling in Denmark and are sometimes called the birth certificate of Denmark. The larger of the 2 stones reads, "Harald, king, ordered this monument made in memory of Gorm his father and in memory of Thyra his mother, that Harald who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian." It is the first historical mention of Denmark as a unified kingdom, and it was Harald Bluetooth who put it there. His son Sweyn Forkbeard eventually rebelled against him, drove him out of Denmark, and Harald died of his wounds in exile in 986 AD. But his stones still stand at Jelling, his name still connects your devices. Not a bad legacy for a king from 1,000 years ago. Chapter 8 Sweyn Forkbeard, the man who conquered England. Sweyn Forkbeard, the son of Harald Bluetooth, was a Danish king who ruled over Denmark and Norway and successfully conquered England. At the time of his death, Sweyn Forkbeard held the crowns of Denmark, Norway, and England. He held England for 5 weeks. It is one of the briefest reigns in English history and one of the most consequential. Sweyn had been raiding England for years. The English king, Ethelred the Unready, whose nickname did not mean unprepared but something closer to ill-counselled or poorly advised, responded to the Viking raids with the disastrous policy of paying tribute. The Danegeld, the protection money that England paid to the Vikings to stop raiding. Enormous sums of silver, extracted from the English population through taxation, handed over to the Danes. It did not stop the raids, it funded them. Sweyn took the money, built more ships, recruited more warriors, returned the following year. In 1013, Sweyn invaded with the intention not of raiding but of conquest. He landed in the north of England, where the Danish settlers of the Danelaw, descendants of the great heathen army that had come with Ivar the Boneless a century and a half before, welcomed him as a liberator rather than an invader. City after city submitted, the north fell quickly, then the Midlands, then London after initial resistance submitted as well. Ethelred the Unready fled to Normandy. Sweyn Forkbeard was king of England. He had conquered the largest and wealthiest kingdom in the British Isles in a single year. And then 5 weeks later he died. He died at Gainsborough on February 3, 1014. The cause is unknown, sudden illness perhaps, or an injury that had not seemed serious at the time. His son Cnut was 17 years old. The English nobles recalled Ethelred, and Cnut was forced to return to Denmark. But he came back, and when he came back, he built something that his father's brief conquest had only pointed toward. Chapter 9, Cnut the Great, the King of Four Kingdoms. Cnut the Great is one of the most underappreciated rulers in English history. He is most famous for the story of the tide, the legend that he sat on his throne at the edge of the sea and commanded the waves to stop, and was proven wrong. The story is almost always told as evidence of royal arrogance, a king so deluded about his own power that he thought he could command the ocean. That is not what the story means. The original account makes clear that Cnut arranged the demonstrations specifically to show his flattering courtiers that he was not all-powerful. He wanted to prove to them that no king, however great, could command the tides. Only God could do that. His legacy was lost after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, and he was misinterpreted as a delusional monarch who believed he had supernatural powers. The opposite was true. He was a man of unusual self-awareness for his era. Cnut was king of England from 1016, of Denmark from 1018, and of Norway from 1028 to 1035. At the height of his power, Cnut commanded the North Sea Empire, encompassing the kingdoms of England, Denmark, and Norway, and also held much influence in Ireland. His reign over the first three countries, which lasted for approximately 14 years before his death in 1042, was arguably the high point of the Viking Age in terms of power and influence. England was the jewel of his empire. He governed it not as a conqueror but as a legitimate English king, using English law, supporting English monasteries and churches, marrying Emma of Normandy, the widow of the previous English king. He brought Danes and English together under cultural bonds of custom and wealth, through power and brutality. His reign was one of the most stable and prosperous periods in English history before the Norman conquest. After decades of Viking raids and Danegeld payments and political chaos, the country had a king strong enough to maintain order and wise enough to govern across cultural divides. He died in 1035 at around 40 years old, young for a king of his achievements. His death marked the beginning of the decline of the Viking Age. The North Sea Empire he had built did not survive him. His sons were weaker and shorter-lived. By 1042, a descendant of the Old English royal line, Edward the Confessor, was on the throne. The age of the great Viking kings of England was over. But it ended at its apex, with the most powerful Norse ruler England ever had. Cnut the Great, the king who proved he could not command the tides. He was right about that. He was wrong about almost nothing else. Chapter 10, Harald Hardrada, the last of the Vikings. The last great Viking king. Harald Hardrada, hard ruler. The translation of his name tells you everything you need to know about his reputation. Hardrada translates as hard ruler, a reputation Harald lived up to with his aggressively militaristic approach to leadership and tendency to settle disputes brutally. He is widely considered to have been the last great Viking ruler, taking the Norwegian throne in 1046 and presiding over a period of peace and progress, and the introduction of Christianity that rather belies his fierce reputation. His life before becoming King of Norway was one of the most extraordinary in the Viking Age. As a young man, no more than 15 years old, He fought alongside his half-brother Olaf Haraldsson in the Battle of Stiklestad. They were defeated in battle, and after Olaf was killed, Harald was banished. Harald fled east. He made his way to the court of Yaroslav the Wise, the ruler of Kievan Rus, the Norse-founded state centered on Kiev that controlled the river trade routes between Scandinavia and the Byzantine Empire. And then he went to Constantinople. He joined the Varangian Guard, the elite mercenary unit of the Byzantine Empire, composed primarily of Norse warriors, who served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine Emperor. For 15 years, Harald Hardrada fought for the Byzantine Empire across the Mediterranean world. In Sicily, in Bulgaria, in the Holy Land, he accumulated wealth, military experience, and a reputation for ferocity and tactical intelligence that made him famous across the known world. He returned to Norway in 1046, claimed the throne through a combination of military force and political skill, and governed the kingdom for 20 years. And then, in 1066, he made the decision that would end his life and end the Viking Age. He invaded England. The English king, Harold Godwinson, had just taken the throne after the death of Edward the Confessor. William of Normandy was threatening invasion from the south, and now Harald Hardrada appeared from the north with a fleet of 300 ships and 15,000 warriors, claiming the English throne on the basis of a disputed agreement made decades earlier. He won his first engagement, the Battle of Fulford Gate, against a northern English army. And then Harold Godwinson marched his army north from London in 4 days, covering 200 miles at a speed that was itself a military achievement, and hit Hardrada at Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire on September 25, 1066. Harold invaded England in 1066 and won at the Battle of Fulford Gate. He then met the army of the new English king, Harold Godwinson, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge and was defeated. His death marked the end to the age of great Viking warrior kings. The battle was decisive. Hardrada and his ally Tostig Godwinson were both killed. The Norse army was broken. 300 ships had brought the Viking army to England. 24 were enough to carry the survivors home. Ragnar Lothbrok, Erik Bloodaxe and Harald Hardrada are a trio of legendary Viking warriors. Towards the end of their careers, each man sailed his longships upriver to Jorvik or York. Not one of them survived to make the journey home. Harald Hardrada died at Stamford Bridge. 3 weeks later, William of Normandy, the descendant of Rollo the Viking, landed on the south coast of England and defeated Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings. The Viking Age was over, ended by a Viking's great-great-great-grandson conquering the kingdom that the last great Viking had tried and failed to take. History has a sense of symmetry. The last fire. And so our 10 chapters come to rest. From Ragnar Lothbrok in the Snake Pit to Harald Hardrada at Stamford Bridge, 2.5 centuries of extraordinary men, warriors and kings and explorers and statesmen, sometimes all 4 simultaneously. They raided monasteries and founded cities. They terrorized half of Europe and traded with the other half. They sailed to North America 5 centuries before Columbus. They established kingdoms in Russia, in France, in Ireland, in England, in Sicily. They were not the one-dimensional berserkers of popular imagination. They were human beings of extraordinary complexity, capable of great violence and great artistry, of brutal raids and careful statecraft, of the ruthless elimination of rivals and the composition of poetry so fine that it is still read today. The Viking Age ended not with a bang but with the gradual absorption of Norse culture into the cultures it had touched. The Normans became French, the Danelaw became English, the Rus became Russian, the Norse settlers in Iceland and Greenland became Icelanders and Greenlanders. The blood of the Vikings runs in populations across the northern world. Their words are in every Germanic and Scandinavian language. Their ships gave us the template for European naval architecture for centuries. Their legal and governmental traditions contributed to the development of parliamentary democracy. And their stories, told by the skalds in the longhouses through the long Norse winters, written down in Iceland centuries later, are still told. Tonight you heard 10 of them. Let those stories settle now, like snow on a Norse hillside. Ragnar in the snake pit refusing to show fear. Ivar the Boneless carried on a shield, directing his army with his hands. Bjorn Ironside in the warm Mediterranean, astonished by the blue water. Rollo receiving the King of France, his man lifting the royal foot without bending. Harald Fairhair finally cutting his hair after 10 years. Erik Bloodaxe in his York fortress, the axes gleaming. Harald Bluetooth standing before his runic monument. Sweyn Forkbeard dying 5 weeks after conquering England. Cnut sitting at the tide's edge, proving to his courtiers that no king commands the sea. Harald Hardrada taking the arrow at Stamford Bridge, the last king of the Viking Age falling in the Yorkshire mud. Let the names grow quiet in the cold Norse dark. The longhouse fire is burning low. The skald has finished his songs. There are no more longships to launch tonight. No more kingdoms to claim, no more seas to cross, no more sagas to begin. Only the fire and the dark and the snow outside and the long quiet night. And sleep, a soft, deep, dreamless sleep. Good night.